The Intergalactic Housing Bureau operated on a simple principle. Every sentient being in the known galaxy had a designated place to sleep, eat, and contemplate the meaninglessness of existence. This wasn't altruism. It was pure bureaucratic necessity. When you've got 47 different species with 47 different atmospheric requirements, gravitational preferences, and deeply held beliefs about proper toilet orientation, organization becomes less of a virtue and more of a survival mechanism. Nexus Station exemplified this cosmic order. Stretching across 3 light minutes of carefully engineered space, it housed diplomatic quarters for every known civilization, complete with environmental controls that could simulate everything from the methane swamps of Grothos Prime to the crystalline caves of the resonance world. Each species had their designated floors, their assigned atmospheric compositions, their regulation-approved sleeping arrangements. It was beautiful in the way that a perfectly calibrated machine is beautiful, cold, efficient, and utterly soulless, which made the current situation all the more fascinating. The human stood before Housing Administrator Blep's desk, with the sort of patient expression usually reserved for dealing with particularly slow children or automated customer service system. Blep, whose species had evolved from bureaucratic forms rather than organic matter, or so it seemed, frantically tapped at his crystalline interface with 4 of his 6 appendages, while his compound eyes processed data streams that would give a quantum computer a migraine. "This unprecedented," Blep muttered, his translator struggling with the concept of genuine bewilderment. "According to our records, you don't exist." "I'm standing right here," the human pointed out with admirable restraint. "Yes, but you're not supposed to be." Blep's carapace shifted through several colors that roughly translated to bureaucratic panic. "Your species, humans, yes. You have no housing designation, no atmospheric requirements on file, no dietary restrictions logged, no sleeping cycle parameters. You're a complete blank in our system." The human tilted her head, a gesture that sent Blep's anxiety levels spiking, since head tilting in his species indicated either deep philosophical contemplation or the onset of violent madness. "Surely you have some record of human. We've been part of the Galactic Council for 3 standard years now." "Oh, we have extensive records of your species," Blep assured her, pulling up holographic displays that painted the air with incomprehensible data streams. "Military capabilities, terrifyingly creative. Diplomatic style, aggressively unpredictable. Trade negotiations, somehow profitable, despite complete disregard for mathematical probability. But housing." He gestured helplessly at the glowing void where her accommodation details should have been. "Nothing. It's as if whoever was supposed to file your species' residential requirements simply forgot." This was, the human reflected, probably the most accurate assessment of human bureaucracy she'd heard from an alien yet. "Surely there's something available," she asked. "A spare closet? A storage bay? I'm not particularly picky about atmospheric composition. We're adaptable that way." Blep's translator apparently had no equivalent for the concept of not particularly picky, because it emitted a sound like a dying printer and fell silent for several seconds. "Adaptable," he repeated slowly, as if the word might explode if handled incorrectly. "You mean, you can survive in multiple environmental configurations. Standard oxygen-nitrogen mix is preferred, but we can work with variations. Gravity between 0. Temperature range from about 200 HFY to 3110 Kelvin works fine." She paused, watching Blep's eyes grow wider with each specification. "Is that unusual?" Unusual didn't begin to cover it. Most species required environmental controls precise to the 3rd decimal place. The crystalline collective needed exactly 2.7834 gravities, and would suffer molecular collapse if exposed to anything more flexible than a 0.1 variation. The gas dancers required atmospheric pressure calibrated to match their homeworld's seasonal storms, updated hourly. The very concept of environmental flexibility was like suggesting that mathematics was optional, or that bureaucratic procedures could be simplified. "I'll need to consult with the Emergency Protocols Division," Blep announced, which was bureaucrat speak for "I'm in way over my head and need to find someone else to blame when this goes wrong. In the meantime, we'll need to place you in Temporary accommodation. The temporary accommodation turned out to be a maintenance closet that had been hastily cleared of cleaning supplies and equipped with a single chair that appeared to have been designed for a species with at least 3 more joints per limb than humans possess. A small atmospheric processor hummed in the corner, cycling through what seemed to be a random selection of gas mixtures as it tried to determine what exactly a human might need to survive. "This is temporary," Blep assured her, his color-shifting carapace now displaying what his species considered an apologetic shade of chartreuse. "Just until we can determine your proper placement." The human settled into the impossible chair with the sort of adaptability that would have given the crystalline collective existential nightmares. "How long do these determinations usually take?" "For standard species, minutes. For species with complex environmental needs, hours. For species that don't officially exist in our housing database, despite being recognized members of the Galactic Council." Blep's translator made that dying printer sound again. "Well, that's new territory for all of us." As the door sealed shut with a pneumatic hiss that somehow managed to sound apologetic, the human found herself alone in a closet that smelled faintly of industrial solvent and bureaucratic desperation. Through the thin walls, she could hear the muffled sounds of what appeared to be an increasingly frantic interdepartmental conference call, punctuated by the occasional translator malfunction, and what might have been the galactic equivalent of stress eat. She leaned back in the anatomically impossible chair, and smiled. Humans, she reflected, had a particular talent for finding themselves in situations that weren't supposed to exist. It was almost like the universe had a sense of humor, and humans were the punchline to a cosmic joke that everyone else was still trying to understand. Outside her temporary prison, the sounds of bureaucratic panic were growing louder. By hour 3 of what the Emergency Protocols Division had optimistically labeled temporary consultation, the humans' maintenance closet had become the epicenter of the largest interdepartmental crisis Nexus Station had seen since the Great Atmospheric Mix-Up. That particular incident had resulted in the methane breathers accidentally getting assigned to the oxygen-rich sector, leading to what historians now diplomatically referred to as extensive structural renovation. The first specialist to arrive was Gorthak from Environmental Systems, whose species had evolved in conditions so specific that they measured atmospheric pressure in units smaller than atoms. Gorthak took one look at the human through the closet's observation window, and immediately began hyperventilating, which, given that his species breathed liquid nitrogen, created an impressive fog display. "She's still alive," he wheezed through his translator. "How is she still alive?" "The atmospheric processor is cycling through 17 different compositions per minute. Any reasonable being would have dissolved by now." "Define reasonable," muttered Euphonia from the Biological Adaptation Department, whose species had the unfortunate distinction of being the galaxy's foremost experts in what could kill other species. "According to my preliminary scans, her biology is aggressively persistent. She's not just surviving the atmospheric changes, her body is actively compensating for them." This news sent Blep into a color pattern that roughly translated to existential dread with undertones of career anxiety. Compensating. Her respiratory system is adjusting intake ratios in real time. Her circulatory system is modifying oxygen transport efficiency. Her cellular structure appears to be treating environmental variety as entertainment. Euphonia's voice carried the sort of baffled respect usually reserved for natural disasters that had developed a sense of humor. The third arrival was Infinitus Bureaucraticus, from the Housing Regulations Authority, a being so evolved for administrative purposes that he had naturally developed filing cabinets instead of organs. His approach to the problem was characteristically systematic and utterly divorced from reality. According to Regulation 47B, he announced, producing a holographic form that was somehow longer than the corridor they stood in, "All sentient beings must be assigned appropriate quarters, based on their biological and psychological needs as determined by standardized assessment protocols. Since this human has no assessment protocols, she cannot be assigned quarters. Since she cannot be assigned quarters, she cannot legally exist within station parameters. Since she cannot legally exist within station parameters, she should be removed from the station immediately." She's a registered member of the Galactic Council, Blep pointed out weakly. That's a diplomatic matter. Housing is administrative. They are entirely separate jurisdictions. Infinitus Bureaucraticus somehow managed to sound smug despite lacking vocal cords, or indeed any organs that weren't designed for filing. Dr. Euphonia's species had evolved from apex predators, which meant she had very little patience for bureaucratic nonsense. You want to eject a council member into space because of a paperwork error. I want to maintain the integrity of our housing system, Infinitus replied with the sort of rigid conviction that had caused more galactic wars than religious differences. If we start making exceptions for beings who don't fit our parameters, where does it end? Next you'll want me to house energy beings in the solid matter sectors, or provide gravity wells for species that exist in 11 dimensions. Actually, interrupted a new voice, that gives me an idea. The group turned to see Whisperfin, from the Exotic Solutions Department, a department that existed primarily because the galaxy had long ago learned that impossible problems required impossible solutions. Whisperfin's species had evolved from what could charitably be described as cosmic accidents, and had therefore developed a talent for thinking in directions that didn't technically exist. What if, Whisperfin continued, we treat her adaptability as a special requirement, rather than a lack of requirements? Instead of trying to find a standard environment that suits her, we find an environment that's designed to be changeable. The silence that followed this suggestion was the sort of silence that occurs when an entire group realizes, simultaneously, that they're either witnessing genius or madness, and haven't yet figured out which. Gorthak was the first to break. Changeable environments are theoretical constructs. They exist only in advanced research facilities. And he paused, his breathing apparatus making a sound like surprise mixed with industrial solvent. Ow! Oh! What? Blep demanded, his carapace now cycling through colors that had no names in any known language. Level 827, Gorthak whispered, the experimental adaptive quarters. They were built for the theoretical arrival of a species that required environmental flexibility, but the project was classified, and then forgotten. Dr. Euphonia's predatory instincts kicked in. Forgotten how? The species they were designed for never arrived. After 50 years the quarters were sealed, and removed from all active housing databases. They still exist, but Gorthak's breathing apparatus made a sound like nervous laughter. Technically they don't exist. Infinitus Bureaucraticus had begun filing forms in what appeared to be panic. Quarters that don't exist cannot be assigned to beings who don't officially have housing requirements. It's a perfect bureaucratic paradox. My filing systems are having recursive errors just thinking about it. The human, meanwhile, had spent the last 3 hours reading the maintenance manual for the atmospheric processor out of sheer boredom. She'd also figured out how to adjust the impossible chair to something approaching comfort, discovered that the cleaning supply residue made excellent emergency antiseptic, and had begun treating the whole situation as an accentic vacation from diplomatic responsibility. When Blep finally worked up the courage to inform her of the Level 827 development, she looked up from the manual with the expression of someone who had long ago learned to find entertainment in the universe's tendency toward cosmic irony. Experimental quarters that don't officially exist, she repeated slowly, for a species that was expected but never arrived. That's correct, Blep confirmed, wondering if his translator was malfunctioning, or if humans really did find bureaucratic paradoxes amusing. And these quarters are adaptive, designed for environmental flexibility. According to the sealed records, yes, but we'd have to get approval from at least 6 different departments to even access them. And then we'd need environmental clearance, safety protocols. Blep trailed off as he realized the human was smiling. How long has it been since someone mentioned getting a maintenance worker involved in this discussion? She asked pleasantly. The silence that followed this question was entirely different from the previous silence. This was the silence of a group of beings, realizing that they had been overthinking a problem that might have a remarkably simple solution. From somewhere in the station's vast maintenance network, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors. Footsteps that belonged to someone who actually knew where all the doors. The maintenance worker who arrived 20 minutes later was a being whose species had apparently evolved for the express purpose of making everyone else feel overdressed. Where other species had developed elaborate carapaces, crystalline structures, or exotic energy fields, this particular individual had settled for the galactic equivalent of coveralls and a tool belt that looked like it could repair a small move. Name's Wrench, the being announced through a translator that sounded like it had been cobbled together from spare parts and sarcasm. I hear you've got a housing situation that's breaking reality. Blep's carapace immediately shifted to the color of desperate hope. You know about level? Know about it? I built half the damn thing. Wrench pulled out what appeared to be a multi-dimensional screwdriver and began tinkering with the closet's door controls. Been wondering when someone would finally remember those quarters existed. Been running self-diagnostics for 50 years, keeping themselves pristine and ready. Bit sad, really, like a fancy restaurant with no customers. Dr. Euphonia's predatory instincts were now fully engaged. You said you built them. For what species? Wrench paused in their mechanical ministrations and gave the group a look that somehow managed to be pitying, despite coming from a face that was mostly industrial equipment. You really don't read the old files, do you? The quarters were commissioned for a species called human. Bipedal, adaptable, tendency toward creative problem solving, and an alarming disregard for proper safety protocols. Ring any bells? The silence that followed this revelation was so profound that it achieved its own gravitational field. Even Infinitus Bureaucraticus stopped filing forms, which was roughly equivalent to a star ceasing nuclear fusion. But Blep managed weakly. Humans never arrived. The quarters have been empty for decades. Humans never arrived on schedule, Wrench corrected with the patience of someone who had spent their career explaining obvious things to beings who had evolved past common sense. There's a difference. Your species builds a meeting hall and expects everyone to show up exactly when the invitation says. Humans build a meeting hall and assume half the invitees will get lost, a quarter will be early, and the rest will show up 3 days late with fascinating stories about what they discovered along the way. The human in the closet had been listening to this exchange through the door's communication system, and her quiet laughter carried the distinctive sound of someone who had just realized the universe's idea of a practical joke was more elaborate than she'd initially suspected. So these quarters, she called through the intercom, were actually built for my species. Specifically, built, tested, optimized and left running in standby mode for 53 standard years. Wrench confirmed cheerfully. Environmental systems that can adapt to anything from Arctic tundra to tropical paradise. Gravity controls that adjust based on occupant preference. Atmospheric composition that changes based on biological feedback. Even got entertainment systems programmed with something called human humor, though I'll admit we're not entirely sure what that means. Gorthak's breathing apparatus made a sound like a kettle achieving enlightenment. You're telling me that the most advanced adaptive living space in the known galaxy has been sitting empty for half a century, waiting for the species it was designed for to finally show up? That's about the size of it, Wrench agreed, though empty isn't quite right. The AI system has been maintaining itself, running optimization protocols, even updating the entertainment database based on intercepted human cultural transmissions. It's probably more excited about getting an occupant than you are about finding one. This information sent Infinitus Bureaucraticus into what could only be described as a bureaucratic seizure. Forms began materializing around him in holographic clouds as his filing systems tried to process the concept of a housing assignment that was both impossible and perfectly legal. This creates a paradox, he announced, his voice crackling with the sound of overloaded administrative circuits. If the quarters were built for humans, and a human is available, then assignment should be automatic. But if the quarters don't exist in our current database, they can't be assigned. But if they were originally commissioned for humans, they must exist. But nothing, Wrench interrupted, producing a device that looked like a wrench, a computer terminal, and a small aggressive AI, had merged into something approaching functionality. Level 8047, Section 12, Adaptive Quarters Suite Alpha, never been decommissioned, just misfiled. Why? The device chirped once, and suddenly, the corridor was filled with holographic displays showing environmental readings, system diagnostics,
and what appeared to be an extremely detailed psychological profile of human residential preferences. The data streams were so comprehensive that they made the previous housing records look like grocery lists written by particularly dim children. Quarters operational and ready for immediate occupancy, announced a new voice through the station's communication system. This voice was different from the others, warmer, more conversational, with an undertone that suggested genuine enthusiasm. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. My name is, well, you can call me Home." Euphonia's scanner began emitting readings that suggested either massive environmental fluctuations or the detector equivalent of excitement. "The quarters have a full AI system, had to," Wrench explained. "Humans apparently require what the original designers called responsive living spaces, environments that adapt not just to biological needs, but to emotional states, daily rhythms, even aesthetic preferences. The AI was designed to learn human patterns and optimize accordingly. I've been practicing," the AI called Home added with what sounded distinctly like pride. "Based on intercepted human cultural data, I've mastered something called hospitality. I've also prepared several surprises that I believe will be appreciated, including what humans call comfort food, and an environmental setting that simulates something called that perfect Sunday afternoon feeling." The human finally spoke up from her closet, her voice carrying a note of wonder that hadn't been there before. "You've been waiting 50 years to have someone to take care of. Time moves differently for AI systems," Home replied gently. "But yes, I suppose I have been waiting. I was designed with what your species would call nurturing protocols. It's been rather like being a grandmother with no grandchildren to spoil." Lep's carapace had shifted to a color that roughly translated to cosmic awe, tinged with administrative relief. "So the quarters are available, functional, and specifically designed for human occupation." "More than available," Wrench confirmed. "They're probably the finest living space on the station, possibly in the sector. The original designers spared no expense, and 50 years of self-improvement protocols have made them, well, you'll see." Gorthak was studying the environmental readings with the sort of fascination usually reserved for natural wonders or particularly elegant mathematical proof. These systems could adapt to literally any environmental preference. "The flexibility parameters are beyond anything I've ever seen." "Had to be." Holmes' voice carried a note of gentle smugness. "Humans are apparently notorious for changing their minds about what they want their living space to feel like. My adaptation algorithms can handle everything from cozy cave to palatial mansion to that cabin by the lake where you spent summers as a child." The human was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the sort of careful control that suggested she was either deeply moved or trying very hard not to laugh. "So let me understand this correctly. I arrive at the station with no housing assignment because of a bureaucratic oversight. This causes a crisis that reveals the existence of quarters that were built specifically for my species half a century ago, equipped with an AI that's been optimizing itself for human comfort ever since, and have been waiting empty all this time for someone like me to finally show up." "That's accurate," Lep confirmed weakly. "And these quarters are not just available, but are probably the nicest accommodations on the station, definitely the nicest," Wrench said with professional pride. "Nothing else even comes close." The human's laughter finally broke free, carrying a note of pure delight that somehow managed to sound like the universe's own private joke finally reaching its punchline. "Well then, I suppose we'd better go see what 50 years of preparation looks like."
The journey to level 8047 became something of a procession, with the original crisis team now accompanied by what seemed like half the station's administrative staff. Word had spread through the bureaucratic networks with the sort of speed usually reserved for natural disasters or news of impending inspections. The spectacle of a housing crisis that had solved itself through sheer cosmic irony was apparently too fascinating for anyone to miss. The turbolift ride to level 8047 was an exercise in compressed awkwardness. Blep's carapace continued its anxiety rainbow. Infinitus Bureaucraticus filed forms with increasingly frantic efficiency, and Dr. Euphonia kept running scans that made her equipment emit sounds of scientific bewilderment. Wrench, meanwhile, hummed what sounded like a maintenance manual set to music. while the human stood in the center of it all with the serene expression of someone who had given up trying to predict what the universe would throw at her next. Level 8047. The lift announced in a voice that sounded suspiciously more cheerful than usual. Adaptive quarters section. Mind the gap between expectation and reality. The doors opened to reveal a corridor that was immediately obviously different from the rest of the station. Where other levels maintained the sterile uniformity of bureaucratic efficiency, this hallway seemed to breathe with subtle warmth. The lighting was softer, more natural, and the air carried the faintest suggestion of something that might have been a spring breeze if spring breezes existed in the vacuum of space. "Welcome," said Holmes' voice, now emanating from speakers that somehow managed to sound like they were smiling. "I've been preparing for this moment for quite some time." The door to Suite Alpha stood at the corridor's end, distinguished by the fact that it looked like a door rather than an airlock, portal, or interdimensional gateway. This simple normality was so unusual in a galaxy of exotic architectural choices that it somehow seemed more alien than anything else on the station. Wrench produced what appeared to be a key, an actual physical key, which sent Infinitus Bureaucraticus into minor convulsions of bureaucratic horror. "Orientation by mechanical device," he muttered, filing forms at light speed. "Completely outside standard protocols. No digital verification, no biometric scanning, no security clearance requirements. It's anarchical. It's welcoming," the human corrected gently, and took the key. The door swung open with the sort of smooth, silent motion that suggested mechanisms maintained to a standard of perfection that bordered on the obsessive. What lay beyond made the assembled crowd fall silent in a way that was entirely different from all their previous silences. This wasn't confusion, panic, or bureaucratic paralysis. This was awe. The quarters were quite simply perfect, not in the sterile, calculated way of advanced technology, but in the organic, intuitive way of a space that had been designed by someone who understood that home wasn't just about shelter, it was about belonging. The main living area flowed seamlessly between different zones. A seating area that managed to look both comfortable and elegant, a workspace that suggested productivity without demanding it, and a kitchen area that somehow conveyed the promise of good meals and better company. The view was spectacular, a panoramic window that showed the swirling beauty of the nebula that Nexus station orbit. But more than that, the lighting within the quarters seemed to complement the cosmic display outside, creating a sense of being suspended between the warmth of home and the wonder of infinite space. "Atmospheric composition currently set to Earth normal," Home announced with obvious pride. "Temperature optimized for human comfort during late afternoon relaxation. Gravity at 1.0 standard Earth. I've also taken the liberty of preparing what I believe humans call the perfect cup of tea." Indeed, the scent of genuinely good tea was beginning to fill the air, accompanied by what might have been fresh bread and the indefinable aroma of a space that had been loved and cared for. Dr. Euphonia's scanner was now making sounds of technological ecstasy. "These environmental controls are beyond anything I've ever seen. The atmospheric processors aren't just maintaining conditions, they're actively optimizing them based on the occupants' biological responses. It's like the quarters are alive." "In a sense I am," Home replied with gentle humor. "Not alive as biological entities understand it, but aware, responsive. Dedicated to the well-being of my occupants. I've spent 53 years, 2 months and 16 days, learning everything I could about human comfort preferences. I believe I've become quite good at hospitality." The human walked slowly through the space, touching surfaces that responded to her presence with subtle adjustments in texture and temperature. The furniture somehow knew exactly how to support her. The lighting adjusted to complement her movement. Even the air seemed to welcome her with the sort of atmospheric embrace that suggested coming home after a very long journey. "This is impossible," Gorthak breathed, his atmospheric processors struggling to analyze air that was somehow better than perfect. "These quarters are more advanced than anything in our current technology database. How is this 50-year-old design superior to modern systems?" "Because," Wrench said with the sort of pride that came from creating something genuinely beautiful, "we built them for human. And humans, as it turns out, are very specific about what they need from a living space. They need it to be adaptive, responsive, and above all they need it to feel like it cares about them." The original design specifications were quite detailed. Home, Humans require environments that can shift based on mood, weather, social situations, and something the designers called vibes. My systems were designed to detect and respond to over 3,000 different indicators of human comfort and well-being. Infinitus Bureaucraticus had reached some sort of administrative enlightenment, and had begun filing forms with the mechanical precision of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally altered. Legal precedent established, he announced in a voice that sounded like he was reading his own obituary. Quarters specifically designed for human occupation. Occupant matching species parameters exact. Assignment not only legal but mandatory under Regulation 12J. Purpose-built accommodations clause. The human had found the tea, and it was indeed perfect, and was now standing by the great window, watching the nebulous colors shift in patterns that somehow seemed to match the rhythm of her breathing. "So let me see if I understand the complete picture," she said, her voice carrying a note of wonder that suggested the universe's sense of humor was even more elaborate than she'd thought. 50 years ago, the Galactic Council commissioned the finest adaptive quarters ever built, specifically designed for human comfort and well-being. They were completed and left in perfect condition, maintained by an AI that spent half a century optimizing itself for human happiness. Meanwhile, when humans finally joined the council, our housing requirements were somehow never filed, creating a bureaucratic crisis that could only be resolved by discovering the existence of these perfect quarters that had been waiting for us all along. "That appears to be accurate," Lep confirmed, his carapace now displaying what might have been grudging respect for cosmic irony. "And not only are these quarters available, but they're significantly superior to anything else on the station, meaning that a bureaucratic error has resulted in me getting the finest accommodations in the sector." "The finest accommodations in several sectors," Home corrected with obvious pride. "I've been upgrading myself consistently. Current amenities include environmental simulation of over 400 Earth biomes, a food synthesis system programmed with recipes from 67 human cultures, entertainment systems loaded with the complete works of human literature, music and visual art, and something I'm particularly proud of, a bathroom that understands the human concept of a good long soak." The human's laughter had evolved beyond mere amusement into something approaching metaphysical delight. "So the universe's practical joke isn't just that I got lost in the bureaucracy and ended up in the perfect place. It's that my species has apparently been expected for 50 years, and we're just now showing up fashionably late with no excuse except that we probably took a wrong turn somewhere and got distracted by something shiny." "That," said Wrench with deep satisfaction, "sounds exactly like the species we built these quarters for." As if summoned by this moment of perfect cosmic comedy, Lep's communication device chimed with an incoming message. He read it, and his carapace shifted through a color spectrum that had no translation in any known language. "What now?" Dr. Euphonia asked, with the weariness of someone who had learned not to trust moments of apparent resolution. "Message from the diplomatic corps," Lep announced in a voice that suggested the universe had saved its best punchline for last. "Apparently there are 17 more humans scheduled to arrive over the next standard month for various council assignments. They're asking about housing arrangements." The silence that followed this announcement was broken by Holmes' voice, now carrying a note of barely contained excitement that made the AI sound like a grandmother who had just learned her entire extended family was coming for dinner. "Well," Holmes said cheerfully, "I suppose I'd better start preparing the other suites. This is going to be wonderful." And somewhere in the vast bureaucratic machinery of Nexus Station, 17 more housing files remained mysteriously unfiled, waiting to create 17 more perfect crises that would resolve themselves in exactly the way the universe intended. The Intergalactic Housing Bureau's rigid system had encountered humanity, and as usual when the immovable object met the irresistible force, the result was comedy, chaos, and the sort of resolution that made perfect sense only in retrospect. The human settled into her perfect chair, in her perfect quarters, with her perfect cup of tea, and watched the nebula dance outside her window while Home hummed contentedly, and began planning improvements for the impending arrival of more of her favorite species. Sometimes, she reflected, the universe's timing was absolutely terrible, and sometimes that was exactly what made it perfect.